Welcome back to another Dragonfly Human Trafficking Awareness Month vlog. So glad to have you here. My name is Melissa Ike. I'm one of the co-founders of the Dragonfly Home, and I'm the Director of Communications and Development, and I am joined by
Whitney Anderson. I'm the executive director and also one of the co-founders of Dragonfly.
and our very special guest today is our friend who can introduce himself.
Sergeant Nick Wheeler. I supervise the Tulsa Police Department's human trafficking and vice unit.
Okay. So, I mean, just by his title, it's pretty obvious as to why we would have invited Nick to join us today. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the Tulsa Police Department human trafficking unit? Is that what you said?
So our official title is the human trafficking and vice unit.
I see.
Okay.
I came into the unit when we were more of a traditional vice unit. So you're talking about street level prostitution interdiction, street level drug sales, basic undercover work that you'd see at any cheesy 1970s cop show.
Okay.
A lot of fun doing that stuff. You get to hang out with your friends and kind of live your alter ego. But in about 2019, we realized that there was significant work that needed to be done in the field of human trafficking, and it was ultimately our unit's responsibility. So we refocused the unit to large-scale human trafficking investigations, and we changed the name of the unit to reflect that prioritization while still retaining some of those responsibilities for street-level drug distribution, illicit gambling, and things like that.
Well, right away, one thing that we wanted you to talk about, Nick, is this difference between, as you call it, street level prostitution and trafficking. Like, what are you can discuss like legal differences and then also like what you are seeing in the field.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we need to address is the common misconception that um, what we would call independent prostitution is in some way empowering for women or that it is a um, feminist flag to bear. Um, it's derogatory in nature. It is inherently based on manipulation and victimization. And almost every single commercial sex worker that we have encountered in our unit's history, if they're not currently being victimized by a pimp or by a human trafficker, they started their life in the game being victimized by a pimp or a human trafficker. So there's trauma and there's victimization associated with almost every single case that you find with commercial sex work.
Yeah, I absolutely love that perspective. I don't think that it's necessarily a popular perspective as I've seen in some of the different things that we've discussed in presentations, but my experience mirrors that. I see so much history of trauma that this business is built on the backs of generally women of color, that it's not empowering in any way. And it's a slippery slope too, right? If we're talking about it being an empowering industry or work, at what point do we empower our young women, our baby girls, that that's not the direction that they should go because it's incredibly dangerous work as well.
Yeah, all of there are so many other crimes that are connected in some way to commercial sex work. It's not just low level misdemeanor prostitution, somebody selling their body because they need a roof over their head for the night, or to feed an addiction, right? Associated crimes that we see with commercial sex work regularly are domestic violence, rape, robbery, drug trafficking, firearms offenses, um, auto theft, um, conspiracy. We see witness intimidation. Um, these are almost standard crimes that go along with every human trafficking case that we work. And at the center of that are the victims that we try to service and get to wraparound services so that they can grow and re-enter our community effective members of society.
Those are all of the very charges that we encounter as advocates on the back end, where we have to work to try to get those charges expunged or whatever method we can try to help them with their criminal record. So,
We just had a discussion earlier today, time stamping when we are recording these vlogs, but with the Homeless Alliance and how those crimes then, those criminal charges are such barriers for when people want to move forward. And so it's serious business. It's not glamorous and it's not, there is this glamorization of this lifestyle, but what you're describing right now is super dangerous.
Mhm.
And it's not something to take lightly.
Right. It's a refreshing perspective to hear from a man.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit,
The
Nick?
only one, I promise.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the role of demand then? I mean, because these crimes, they wouldn't exist if there was no demand for illicit sex, or when we talk about labor trafficking as well, for free or cheap labor. We'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and you really just kind of hit the nail on the head, right? So, um, historically, uh, agencies and advocates have conducted human trafficking awareness training through the perspective of, or through a lens of an economic model. Uh, in the last few years, a lot of groups in this space have tried to get away from that, say, well, it's not strictly an economic model. And what I always say is, well, I'm not an econ professor, nor do I want to be, right? So maybe if you get into like advanced mathematic models, it doesn't fit exactly. But if you just look at a really basic supply and demand capitalist model, nearly all crime types fit into that in some way. Because if there wasn't a demand for a product, then there would be no supply of that product. So there is a demand from buyers for cheap labor, if you're talking about labor trafficking, or for a product to be brought to market, especially underground products, to be brought to market, you have to have a labor force for that. And then if we're specifically talking about sex, there is a demand in our society, there always has been, and it's growing, for access to easy, um, stress-free, no strings attached sexual encounters. And one of the major drivers of that is easy access to pornographic material online. There are plenty of studies that demonstrate the addiction component and the chemical changes that actually occur in the brain whenever people become addicted to online pornography. And now they're going to seek to uh, live those experiences in the real world. And they can't do that with their wife. And they can't do that by going and meeting a girl the traditional way at church or a bar or at prom or fill in the blank, because that's not how real people act in real life. So they purchase it. And by purchasing it, they are supplementing a continuing cycle of violence and degradation on the back end that they don't see.
That's very powerful. Yeah.
So, Nick, would you want to talk about what we're doing in Oklahoma to try to curb this demand and like deterrence activities that you're seeing?
Yeah, so we're trying a kind of a multi-pronged approach, and it's happening in stages in Oklahoma. But I feel like we are ahead of the curve with most of the country. Um, so last year, through the Oklahoma Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which the Tulsa Police Department's Human Trafficking Advice Unit is the law enforcement partner for, and of course, Dragonfly Home are members of the OCAT as our Oklahoma City service providers. Um, the Working through our policy and data committee last year, we were able to pass legislation that changed soliciting prostitution, which is the purchase of sex in Oklahoma, from a misdemeanor to a felony on the first offense. Um, that was a huge step forward. To my knowledge, there's only one state that I know of that has a similar law, and that's Texas. There may be one or two others. But by and large, I travel nationally and train and attend conferences, and it is new and cutting edge. Um, of course, we never do anything, or rarely do we do anything perfect the first time. And so we're seeking amendments in this legislative session so that our prosecutor partners have more tools available to them to combat the demand side of human trafficking. And those are still in the works with some of our legislative partners. Another thing that we are trying is addressing demand reduction through counseling and therapy services. We have partners in Oklahoma who manage NGOs, and they are focused on providing support and services to the buyers of commercial sex so that they can receive training and counseling services and strengthen family bonds and then reintegrate into society so that they aren't providing the demand that drives these criminal acts.
That's a very specific calling to be like a therapist for something like that. But I mean, that's so needed. I think that could be super effective, right? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to kind of unpack the why the felony portion matters. I think that a lot of people don't really understand
Mhm.
how trafficking can work. Like, do traffickers base some of their activities in states with less harsh laws? Do sex purchasers communicate about places where they may or may not get caught easier?
And it also just might be interesting for viewers if you wanted to even talk about like what does that actually mean, the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony? We know that it's more severe, but what does that mean if somebody gets that felony conviction for purchasing sex? So all of those questions. And go.
Yeah, no pressure, right? Yeah. So what we saw in, I believe, 2021, the state of Texas passed legislation that made all commercial sex activity in the state a first offense felony. Um, and through law enforcement contacts with victims and with pimps and traffickers, what we realized was having that felony threat in Texas was having a very direct impact on migration of commercial sex from Texas into Oklahoma. And so we wanted to combat that. The best way to combat it was through some sort of a legal tool that made Oklahoma a space that traffickers did not want to operate. Right, we wanted to drive that to other parts of the country. Well, we want to eradicate it, right? But we have to start in our own backyard. And so we found some legislative partners who had real significant, very personal connections to the trauma that human trafficking can cause in families and in communities. And so they were just as passionate as our service providers and our law enforcement officers in trying to combat that. And so we were able to get soliciting on the books as a felony. So a felony just provides for greater threat for prosecution and punishment in court, provides for more serious prison sentencing, more serious potential fines or deferred sentences, things like that. And it stays on your record. So it makes it much more difficult for offenders to get off the hook through the plea agreement process and things like that. It also forces those buyers to face head on what they've done because it will have a real impact on their personal lives. So we want our buyers or potential buyers to think about those possible consequences and that social stigma before they victimize someone. Because whether they see it as that or not, essentially what they're purchasing is the victimization of another person. What that commercial sex worker is doing is being engaged for the profit of another person for their repeated rate. Never have I encountered a commercial sex worker with a pimp or a trafficker that said, yes, I wanted to have sex with all of these strangers for money that I was never going to see. And so we want to stop that. One way that we can stop that is by making the penalties in Oklahoma as stiff as we can for the demand side.
Nick, you just talked about one innovative approach to tackling the issue of trafficking. And I know another very innovative approach is really true collaboration with advocates and then law enforcement using a trauma-informed approach, which I have to brag on you all. I had the great honor of being able to witness your team in action during an operation. I was blown away. I mean, just blown away by how you all carried out your work, making sure that people had their dignity, that they felt valued, that they knew that there were resources available. It was just pretty incredible. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the high praise. It it's not anything that we're doing that is particularly special or unique to us. All we did is we cobbled together a lot of ideas. Other agencies and groups said, well, we wish we had this, or we're doing it this way, but we're not doing these things. And we said, if this is supposed to be the best practices, why don't we just do it? Um, so, so there's nothing inherently unique in our approach other than we just started doing the things everybody was talking about doing. Um, One thing I tell law enforcement whenever I conduct training, or I tell my guys all the time, is we have to look at the individuals that we encounter as victims that are worthy of our respect and our support. And there's an important distinction that we need to make when we're dealing with victims of human trafficking. That is, they're victims for the purposes of the cases that we're investigating, and they're worthy of dignity and respect and support services to help them overcome their trauma and return to society and be productive members of society and of their families. But we can't forget that that doesn't mean that they're innocent people, right? Oftentimes, these individuals have engaged in lifelong um, high risk habits, associated crimes, and it's very difficult for law enforcement to parse through which crimes might this person be liable for of their own volition, and which ones are they being compelled to engage in because of a result of their trafficking situation. And so we want to start off with these individuals when we encounter them as, for us, they're victims first, and they're worthy of respect. And we'll figure out the rest as we go through our investigation. Um, so what we started doing is, rather than the old model, which I call the call out model, which would be I would go into the field, I would encounter a commercial sex victim, and then I would talk to them and try to convince them to go to a shelter. And so I've just encountered a person that distrusts law enforcement. They've probably had a history of bad encounters with law enforcement. They've been trained to distrust us and to hate us. I look and talk and act like the people that have been paying to rape them for years. I'm there under the ruse of a person that's going to pay to rape them. And now I'm trying to build trust. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons. One is all of the things I just talked about, that there's an inherent distrust in that situation. The second is a lot of our service providers wouldn't be available when we would call. And so many of our service provider organizations, it's not like going to McDonald's where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you have a full staff on board ready to go at a moment's notice, right? We're talking about people that are passionate about the work that they're doing. They're very good at the work that they're doing, but they're not robots. You can't be awake and available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so I would call our service providers at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday and say, hey, I need you to come out here, be here in the next 20 minutes to take charge of this victim for us because we have a trafficker we've got to go chase. And we were regularly getting told, no, we don't have any availability. So the best way that I could think to overcome those obstacles was to just take my service providers, stick them in my back pocket, and take them into the field with me. So we started working with our local service providers, which is the spring, and we made sure that we vetted the people we were bringing into the field with us, because they are going to hear, see, and do things that may not make a lot of service providers comfortable. When we talk about things we have to do for law enforcement safety, or language that they may hear. So we had to make sure that we all understood one another's roles, and we all had thick skin. I also had to make sure that my officers knew that after each operation, be prepared to hear some tough feedback from our service provider partners, because it's only going to make us better. And so now the way that we do things is we pre-plan operations. Our service providers are a part of that planning process from the very beginning. So we identify when we're going to conduct an operation. I will notify our service provider partners, hey, I need availability at this time. And then as early as possible, I will get them copies of our operations plans. I'll explain to them why we're doing what we're doing, what is the target, what's the intent behind the operation, and then they're in the field with us. After we've wrapped up the operation, we go back and we do our debriefs, and we're filing reports and things like that. Our service providers are there with us doing those, because they have legitimate feedback that can make us better. So functionally, the way that works in the field is, once we encounter a victim of human trafficking or a commercial sex worker, because at that time we don't know if they're independent or not, before we conduct any law enforcement interview or anything like that, we immediately hand those individuals off to our service providers to start building rapport and addressing immediate needs. So the way that I brief my guys is, we're going to do all of what I call the quote unquote bad stuff in one location that's controlled by law enforcement. And what I mean by the bad stuff are the things you expect to happen when you're getting arrested or detained by police, right? The things that is going to get our victims' anxiety up. It's going to possibly make them angry, but it's necessary for the safety of everybody involved in the operation. So we're talking about, they're going to go into handcuffs, they're going to get searched. We're going to remove any drugs or weapons from them. We're going to run them so that we can see if they have any serious warrants or if they have violent tendencies, things like that. Ideally, that process takes about 3 minutes. I always want it to last less than 5. And so that's very quick. We're not questioning them during that period. We're not reading them their rights. The first conversation that they are actually going to have is going to be in a separate location with service providers, because I want to detach them from the place that all this bad stuff just happened to them. And as long as they're not being combative with this, and I feel like our service providers will be safe, we're going to take them out of handcuffs and we're going to leave them alone with our service providers to have a conversation. That does a few things. So from a law enforcement side, what it actually does is it frees us up. We're not having to quote unquote babysit a victim while we're trying to do our work as part of our investigation. We can actually start doing the investigative work. We start trying to identify if there's a trafficker involved, and trying to locate and apprehend that trafficker while this conversation's happening on the backside. The other thing that it does is it immediately de-escalates the situation for our victim. So we can put them into a safe place. They can start to get stabilized. Our service providers work their magic, right? The changes in attitude and perspective that we receive from victims after we connect them with service providers it's stark. But if we need to address immediate concerns like food, water, shelter, possible drug withdrawal, right? Things like that, our service providers can start to form that plan, and they can start to address those needs right now. The other thing it does for us is our service providers can start to sell our victims on the idea of it's okay and it's safe to work with law enforcement. So what we've seen from that is before these joint operations, we would have less than 10% of the victims that we encounter participate in law enforcement investigations. Um, when we do a large scale focused operation over multiple days, which Whitney, that's kind of what you came out and witnessed, we're hitting about 85% now of victims that accept services and participate in the law enforcement investigation. And through the life of these operations, including a lot of smaller scale operations that we've done, we're hitting about 55%. So it is a significant difference. It's significant that I can look a victim in the eye and I can tell them, I want you to meet Miss Whitney. She's here to help you. She does not work for me, and she will not talk to me about anything that you two discuss unless you want her to. And then I just step out of the room and let you have a conversation. Um, those are small promises that I can make and I can keep, and it helps build trust and rapport with our victims.
I was hoping that you would share some of those statistics and the receptivity rate of services and people really getting the help that they need. So I'm just super grateful for that information.
I mean, it seems I can see, as never having been in law enforcement, right? I can see how maybe someone hearing this model is like, this is not helpful. This is not going to help us, but then the actual outcome of it is massively
Yeah.
more beneficial and like it's a proven model.
Yeah, and I'll
Yeah,
say you can maybe speak to this, Nick, because we both, I believe, have experience in this realm. But naturally, advocates and law enforcement, they have different roles, and sometimes that can cause some tension, and it can be adversarial at times. But it doesn't have to be, right? And so I think that that comes with the true collaboration that's happening in Tulsa. And that comes with relationship. It comes with honesty and open communication. And that's what you've built. And that's, it's not the easiest thing to do. But you've proven that it can work.
It's worth the effort.
Yeah.
it's definitely worth the effort, and those adversarial relationships, we've done a really good job of overcoming those in the Tulsa area. Um, we've conducted some national training with other agencies and organizations that have requested information on how we do it. We've consulted with some other agencies, but that's not to say there's no adversarial relationship. And I think that's a good thing, right? There's health in conflict sometimes. Um, the same thing happens when law enforcement and prosecutors, whenever you're talking about a case, right? Because sometimes those tough, honest conversations happen through argument, right? Button heads and advocating for your position, right? So there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's not tipping into a toxic relationship model.
So, Nick, one of the things that we're focusing on this month for Human Trafficking Awareness Month, but also literally every single day of our lives for over a decade, is dispelling myths and misconceptions around human trafficking. We've said it in other videos, but it's not just a matter of, oh, it's better to know, just generally speaking, good information about trafficking. Sure. But it can be the difference between people being identified as experiencing trafficking, getting help, and it can literally be life-saving. And so we are once again this month talking about those common myths and misconceptions. And we would love to hear from you and law enforcement. What are you hearing the people say about trafficking that's flat out wrong?
Yeah. So, I mean, we could do a whole day of this, right?
Yeah. Date
Um,
your favorites then.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, really quickly in the public, you've got a lot of urban myths out there, right? Somebody put zip tying on my rearview mirror when I was at the grocery store. I've been targeted for human trafficking. Or there was one a couple of months ago. I actually had a service provider reach out to me that we work with and said, "Hey, somebody that we know found this in the parking lot, and they're wondering if it's human trafficking related." And it was a number written in shoe polish on the back window of a car, which is how auction vehicles are sold. I mean, it was, the idea that individuals are being, kids are being kidnapped off of playgrounds and transported across state lines or cross board national international boundaries to be trafficked. I mean, those things simply don't happen. I used to train and do cases with Ed Snow, who is now the magistrate in the Eastern District of Oklahoma. He was a federal prosecutor for years who specialized in human trafficking cases. And between the two of us and all of our years of experience and all of the cases that we had worked, hundreds of cases combined, neither one of us could point to that fact pattern ever occurring in Oklahoma or anywhere else that we'd read about. I've consulted with some law enforcement agencies in Europe, really across Western Europe, as they try to combat human trafficking. And one thing that I kind of give on that myth is, if you're in Europe and you have a high-speed free rail system that crosses international boundaries, maybe you'll see something like that. It's not something we see here in the United States, right? Other myths that you'll see in misconceptions is we already addressed it's empowering for women to do this myth. For law enforcement specifically, and for a lot of prosecuting attorneys, there's still this idea that it's consensual. That there's this idea that two consenting adults are agreeing to this transaction and there's nothing criminal about that. It's ignoring the forced criminality aspect. It's ignoring the victimization. It's ignoring the illicit nature of the transaction. So all of these are common myths and misconceptions that you'll get. Some of the problems that we have, some of the challenges we have with that is because that was kind of the perspective for law enforcement, for prosecutors for so long, and still is clinging to, hanging on by a thread. You don't have a lot of people that have worked these types of cases. So you spend a lot of time teaching law enforcement about the victimology and about the illicit nature of the crime, or illicit economics of the crime. You spend a lot of time having to train judges and attorneys about what it is. And so all of that soaks up time, it soaks up energy, and our poor prosecutors' offices, I mean, they're just inundated with caseloads that they don't have anywhere close to the manpower to handle. So when they're trying to figure out how to triage cases and reduce their caseload, the cases they don't understand go quicker, right? And so it's a constant fight to make sure these cases are getting filed, because we're doing a disservice to our victims if we're ignoring their perpetrators.
And it's a disservice to the community.
Mhm.
And also, I mean, when you have a lack of prosecutions, let's apply it to what we do at Dragonfly. If people see a lack of convictions of trafficking, people want statistics, people want numbers. And it looks like, oh gosh, it's only like a handful of cases where this is even happening in Oklahoma in a year. It doesn't look like it's happening here, even though it is. And so, I mean, there's a lot of hard implications on every level as to like why this has to be prosecuted. And I mean, coming back down to the people we serve and the things that they tell us when their perpetrator is prosecuted and they get that jail
Yeah.
time. And I mean, the freedom and the justice in the sense of not having this cloud hanging over someone's head all the time, looking over their shoulder constantly,
Yeah.
like the freedom that can happen for somebody who's experienced trafficking is very real. I mean, on every single level, making these prosecutions happen is crucial
Yeah.
to fighting human trafficking in this multi-pronged approach.
Yeah,
Right.
and one thing that we talk about for our unit is, law enforcement tracks our success by historic, right? By how many people did we arrest? How many times we put handcuffs on somebody? How many convictions did we get? Things like that. In human trafficking, that number is going to be a lot lower because we have less participating victims. We have statistically a lower number of crimes occurring, right? More cars get stolen than people get trafficked. That's a good thing, right? But it's just the fact of the matter. And so we look at these cases, and I say, well, in Oklahoma, there's a difference, right? We have human trafficking as a law, we have pandering, which is just a fancy word for pimping, right? So the differences between the two, though, are pandering is that somebody is selling sex for your financial profit, essentially, right? Human trafficking, we have to be able to prove either the element of force, fraud, or coercion. And so what I train law enforcement is I'm convinced that every single pandering case that I've ever made is a human trafficking case that I couldn't prove in court. Because force, fraud, and coercion are so easy, right, to do, but they can be very hard to prove, especially coercion. Um, Coercion can be something like uh, I'm in a relationship with my victim. I'm going to take her child and I'm going to drop her off at my mom's house to babysit, and I'm going to take her to a hotel. And I'm going to tell her, you have to make X number of money or X amount of dollars before we can go back and pick up the baby. Well, I'm being coerced because my kid's being held over my head for that. How do I prove that without the participation of the victim? I can't. I don't have physical evidence of that. So these are common themes throughout the work that we do. The numbers are lower compared to other crimes, and like I said, that's a good thing. Every tip that I investigate that turns out to be a false lead doesn't turn out to be a case. I tell my guys that's a win for the community. That's one less person that's being trafficked. Law enforcement doesn't historically look at cases like that. We look at where's the bad guy. I need to put the bad guy in jail. Um, what we've done is we changed our approach. We don't track our success based on arrests and convictions. We track our success based on victims that we've recovered. Now, whether or not that victim stays engaged with wraparound services is not a stat that I can track because of confidentiality laws. And it's not something I need to know. What I need to know is that I've connected them to services that can assist them. So we track our success based on the victims that we recover. And we track our success based on the idea that whether or not our victim participates in prosecution, once we get that conviction, that is a critical step in the victim recovery process, right? Just like you were talking about, Melissa, right? If you're a victim of human trafficking, but you don't want to participate in prosecution because you don't trust us, or you've trauma bonded to your trafficker, or whatever the case may be. If you're engaged with victim services and wraparound services, and a year or 2 years down the road, we can come in and we can say, hey, your trafficker just got sentenced to 30 years in prison. You're never going to have to worry about them ruining your life or threatening you or your family or your child again. The weight that has to lift off of their shoulders so that they can actually re-engage with their therapy program and re-engage with society, it's huge.
This piece we've seen it from our perspective day in and day out. When those things happen, when relationships exist, when this collaboration is happening and people are held accountable. I mean, I'm thinking of one specific young lady right now, like the moment that she did her witness impact statement and she saw her abuser held accountable, that's when she started pursuing school and therapy and engaging more heavily in services and not worrying so much about safety and getting to be a mom. Like all of that, there's just so much good in working all together to make sure that we're tackling trafficking together. It's such a complex issue. It requires a complex response. And what you've given us today is exactly that. Like, this is what it is.
I think like one thing that we've talked about in this series is there's so much hope. This is a really hard topic. I mean, the things we've talked about today, these are hard things, but you all have taken the typical model and you've flipped it on its head and you're seeing these incredible outcomes. And there is some momentum with sharing that amongst law enforcement in the US. That is big cause for celebration and for hope in all of this. And so we thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to the Spring as well.
Yeah.
As one of your collaborating partners in Tulsa that we've referenced a few times, but
Mhm.
I would recommend checking them out if you're in that area. It's thespringok.org.
Yep.
They're an incredible organization. We love them dearly, and we also benefit from working to provide a statewide response to this horrific issue, and it's all together.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for watching. The Dragonfly Home's mission is to walk alongside victim survivors of human trafficking on their path to healing and restoration. You can learn more about us at thedragonflyhome.org, and our 24-hour human trafficking helpline is 405-212-3377. If you or someone you know has an issue with trafficking and you need to talk to someone about it, we're available 24 hours a day. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.